Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. Yesterday, the U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the case of Fisher versus the University of Texas. In this case, Abigail Fisher is challenging the constitutionality of the university's affirmative action plan. In order to understand that plan, you need some background information, and I'm going to briefly provide that information. So it's important to understand that 75% of the students are not affected at all by the affirmative action plan at the university. For that 75%, they are selected based on the fact that they are in the top 10% of their high school graduating class. So regardless of what high school they go to, if they're in the top 10%, they are guaranteed admission to the university. So the remaining 25% of the students admitted to the university are affected by the university's affirmative action plan. And the way the university is set up, they consider several factors in admissions. They consider grades, they consider scores, and they also have a third category that considers various things like extracurricular activities, economic background, or other factors. And among those other factors considered is race. So race is merely one factor among many factors that the university considers in its admission policy for only 25% of the students who are admitted to the university. Now, during oral arguments, the attorney representing the university or the attorney advocating for the affirmative action plan basically said that if that affirmative action plan is eliminated, the diversity at the university will plummet substantially. The numbers of African Americans at the university will plummet drastically. And he made that point and stressed that point. And in response to that point, Justice Scalia made some rather controversial remarks. And his remarks have generated a lot of discussion online and just in general about affirmative action and the future of affirmative action, and just about the issue of race and racism. So I'm going to read his quote, and then I'm going to provide my commentary afterwards. So here's what Justice Scalia said. He said, there are those who contend that it does not benefit African Americans to get them into the University of Texas where they do not do well, as opposed to having them go to a less advanced school, a slower track school where they do well. One of the briefs pointed out that most of the, and it says, most of the black scientists in this country do not come from schools like the University of Texas. And then he goes on to say, they come from lesser schools where they do not feel that they're being pushed ahead in classes that are too fast for them. And then he goes on to say this, I'm just not impressed by the fact that the University of Texas may have fewer. Maybe it ought to have fewer. Maybe some, when you take more, the number of blacks, really competent blacks, admitted to lesser schools turns out to be less. And I don't think it stands to reason that it's a good thing for the University of Texas to admit as many blacks as possible. I just don't think. And those are direct quotes. And he repeated a couple of words, so it sounds like, I was stuttering or whatever, but those are direct quotes, and I guess he was repeating himself and stuttering during his statement. And the audio will be released on Friday, but I just wanted to read that statement so I could give you the context for this discussion. Essentially what you have here is a man suggesting that black people are less intelligent, that we're inferior mentally, and he's implying that we are less than human. And these are long-going stereotypes that have existed about African Americans throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, actually. They used to do studies of the brain, and they used to draw diagrams suggesting black people have a smaller brain than white people, suggesting that black people were less evolved than white people, that we were somehow like the missing link between humans and apes. In fact, they have even depicted us as apes. And they used to have human zoos where we would be on display like any other animal at a zoo. That's how these people view black people. I'm not surprised by racism in America. The thing that is most troubling is the fact that these statements are not coming from the KKK. They're not coming from some neo-Nazi. They're not coming from David Duke. They are coming from Justice Scalia, a justice on the Supreme Court, someone who has impact and an effect on our lives, someone who is about to render a decision in a case that will decide whether or not we have an opportunity to get a higher education. It is troubling, it is sickening that you have someone like this on the Supreme Court. See, this is what we talk about when we talk about white supremacy in this country, when we talk about white racism in this country. This is an example of that. There's a big difference between someone espousing some views on some corner, not having power, a black person, for instance, making statements that are viewed as anti-white. That man's statements mean nothing when compared to the statements of a justice who is about to render a decision that will determine what kind of educational opportunities black people have. So it is ridiculous for people to compare so-called black racism to white racism, to compare black statements to white actual power. So this man made these racist statements. And while he made these racist statements, there was a black Supreme Court justice on that bench as well, named Clarence Thomas. This man didn't say a word. This man didn't say a peep. This man often joins Justice Scalia when they render decisions. He's often voting along with Justice Scalia. And when this decision is rendered in this case, I'm sure that he will be voting right along with Justice Scalia, even though Justice Scalia just insulted him and every other black man in this country and every other black person in this country. But yet this Uncle Tom, this Uncle Ruckus, this sellout Negro had nothing to say when he benefited from affirmative action. What is Justice Scalia saying about people like Clarence Thomas when he makes these statements? He's not only questioning, he's questioning every black person's intelligence when he makes those statements. He's questioning even Justice Thomas's intelligence. But Justice Thomas says nothing. Justice Thomas goes along with the destruction of affirmative action, even though he benefited from affirmative action. He wouldn't be a lawyer if it wasn't for affirmative action. He wouldn't be sitting on the Supreme Court bench if it wasn't for affirmative action. He wouldn't have graduated from Yale Law School if it wasn't for affirmative action. Yet this man is about to render a decision that will destroy affirmative action. He is about to burn a bridge that he crossed over into the land of opportunity. He's going to burn that bridge and leave a lot of his fellow black people behind. And it's an absolute disgrace that we have someone like this on the bench. someone who is nothing but a puppet of white supremacy. Whenever black issues come up before this court, this man, for the most part, is silent. When black issues come up, this man is voting to eliminate our rights each and every time, whether it's voting rights, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's education. This House Negro is voting along with racists like Justice Scalia. He says nothing in the face of this racism. In fact, he participates in it. This man had the nerve to question black intelligence. Black people were the founders of human civilization. We gave the world math, science, medicine, philosophy, art, language. We gave the world these things, while the white man was in the caves of Europe. We were building civilization. But yet we have been reduced to such a level that we have a Supreme Court justice questioning our intelligence as a people. We have been reduced to such a level that we are begging our very enemy for a seat at his university so he can educate us. It's a terrible situation. With the destruction of affirmative action, we will be denied a chance to get an education at these higher, more distinguished universities. And often those universities determine what kind of opportunities you have, what kind of job opportunities or prospects you have in life. I mean, how many people will be denied an education because of a possible end of affirmative action? The fact that this court decided to take this case on raises a lot of questions, especially after they ruled to uphold affirmative action, and then they remanded this case. Now the case is back before the Supreme Court. Even though this case satisfies all the requirements of a prior case dealing with affirmative action, the Grutter decision, is still before this court. And that causes me to be concerned. Black people need to prepare for a day when affirmative action will no longer exist. We need to be competitive. We need to do everything in our power to make our children as competitive as possible in this world. We can no longer rely on the generosity of our enemy. And there's a powerful quote from John Henrik Clarke. And basically he's saying that your enemy is not going to give you an education. He's not going to truly educate you because he wants to maintain power. And he knows that when you have power, when you have knowledge, that you will take power. So he keeps you miseducated. That's why you have all these educated black folks who, instead of doing things to advance their people, instead of doing things to further the progress of black people in this country, many of these educated black people, the first thing that they do is they remove themselves from the black community. They identify with their oppressor. They marry their oppressor. They lose touch with their community, and they end up being mouthpieces for white supremacy, just like Justice Thomas. So despite having these degrees and recognition and all that kind of stuff, they're completely miseducated, as Dr. Carter G. Woodson warned us about. So the bottom line is this: we need to prepare for a day when this affirmative action is gone. Because if we're going to be dependent on these kinds of people to keep this affirmative action in place, then we're in sad shape. We're in sad shape. And often, I'll just conclude on this note. I mean, people often talk about how elections don't matter. Some people say this all the time, like they're imparting some kind of words of wisdom, when all they're imparting is words of ignorance and stupidity. Affirmative action is at stake right now. And the people that are making the decisions about that have been appointed by elected officials, by the President of the United States, by different presidents. So when you elect a president, you also indirectly appoint justices to the Supreme Court and just the federal bench in general. So this is a direct example of how elections matter. If another president was elected, Scalia wouldn't be on that bench today. If another president was elected at the time, Justice Thomas wouldn't be on that bench. Somebody else that may be more progressive would be on that bench. In this case, wouldn't even be before us, probably. But because of who was elected president at the time, they appointed those right-wing justices like Thomas, Alito, and Scalia, who have the power to render decisions getting rid of voting rights, getting rid of Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, and possibly getting rid of affirmative action, a program that made it possible for people like me to go to law school. So I can't emphasize enough how important our vote is and why each and every one of you need to get out there and register and vote. Because if you don't, we may end up with somebody like Donald Trump being president of the United States. Do you really want a bigot like him to put more people on the Supreme Court like Justice Scalia or Justice Thomas?